Hello. Yeah, I'm reading chapter 35 right now, 8:20. I'm gonna try to go without taking a break. So I'm gonna try to make it one full video. But, if I don't, then that's okay. Sorry. Okay, sip. Okay, chapter 35, the Cold War begins. The American people, 140 million strong, cheered their nation's victories in Europe and Asia it's been a while since I've read. In Europe and Asia at the conclusion of World War II, but before the shouting had even faded, many Americans began to worry about their future. 40 fiery years of global war had not entirely driven from their minds the painful memories of the 12 desperate years of the Great Depression. Still more ominously, victory celebrations had barely ended before America's crumbling relations with its wartime ally, the Soviet Union, threatened a new and even more terrible international conflict. Truman, the gutty man from Missouri. Presiding over the opening of the post-war period was an accidental President, Harry S. Truman. Truman, owlishly bespectacled, with his graying hair and friendly toothy grin, Truman was called the average man's average man. Even his height, 5 feet 8 inches, was average. The first president in many years without a college education. He had farmed, served as an artillery officer in France during World War I, and failed as a haberdasher. He then tried his hand at precinct-level Missouri politics, through which he rose from a judgeship to the U.S. Senate, through a protege Excuse me. Through a protege of a notorious political machine in Kansas City, he had managed to keep his own hands clean. The problems of the post-war period were staggering, and the suddenly burdened new president at first approached his task with humility, but gradually he evolved from a shrinking pipsqueak into a scrappy little cuss, gaining confidence to the point of cockiness. When the Soviet foreign minister complained, "I've never been talked to like that in my life," Truman shot back, "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." Truman later boasted, "I gave him the 1-2 right to the jaw." A smallish man thrust suddenly into a giant job, Truman permitted designing old associates of the Missouri gang to gather around him, and, like Grant, was stubbornly loyal to them when they were caught with cream on their whiskers. On occasion, he would send critics hot-tempered and profane SOB letters. Most troubling, he was inclined to go off half-cocked or stick maliciously into a wrong-headed notion. To err is to Truman, cynics jibed. But if he was sometimes small in the small things, he was often big in the big things. He had down-home authenticity, few pretensions, rock-solid probity, and a lot of that old-fashioned character trait called moxie. Not one to dodge responsibility, he placed a sign on his White House desk that read, "The buck stops here." Among his favorite sayings was, "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." His meal would be tested as tensions with Russia heated up. Yalta, bargain or betrayal? Vast and silent, the Soviet Union continued to be the great enigma. The conference at Tehran in 1943, where Roosevelt first met Joseph Stalin man to man, had cleared the air somewhat, but much remained unsolved, especially questions about the post-war fates of Germany, Eastern Europe, and Asia. The Yalta Conference, the final fateful meeting of the Big Three, took place in February 1945. At this former czarist resort on the relatively warm shores of the Black Sea, Stalin, Churchill, and the fast-failing Roosevelt reached momentous agreements after pledging their faith with vodka. Final plans were laid for smashing the buckling German lines and assigning occupation zones in Germany to the victorious powers. Stalin agreed that Poland, with revised boundaries, should have a representative government based on free elections, a pledge he soon broke. Bulgaria and Romania were likewise to have free elections, a promise he also flouted. The Big Three further announced plans for fashioning a new international peacekeeping organization, the United Nations. Of all the grave decisions at Yalta, the most controversial concerned the Far East. The atomic bomb had not yet been tested, and Washington strategists expected frightful American casualties in the projected assault on Japan. From Roosevelt's standpoint, it seemed highly desirable that Stalin should enter the Asian War, pin down Japanese troops in Manchuria and Korea, and lighten American losses. Stalin, striking a hard bargain, agreed to attack Japan within 3 months after the collapse of Germany. In return, the Soviets were promised the southern half of Sakhalin Island, lost to Japan in 1905, Japan's Kuril Islands, and control over the railroads and 2 key seaports in China's Manchuria. As it turned out, Moscow's muscle was not necessary to knock out Japan. Critics charged that Roosevelt had sold Chiang Kai-shek down the river. I literally don't even know how to... Which one is the pronunciation? Is it in the one in parentheses or not? Who knows? Down the river when he conceded control of Manchuria to Stalin. The consequent undermining of Chinese morale, so the accusation ran, contributed powerfully to Jiang's overthrow by communists 4 years later. The critics also assailed the sellout of Poland and other Eastern European countries. Roosevelt's defenders countered that Stalin, with his mighty Red Army, could have secured much more of China if he wished, and that the Yalta Conference really set limits on his on his ambitions. Apologists for Roosevelt also considered that if Stalin had kept his promise to support free elections in Poland and the liberated Balkans, the future of U.S.-Soviet relations would have looked different. At the time of Yalta, Soviet troops occupied much of Eastern Europe, and a war to throw them out was unthinkable. The fact is that the Big Three at Yalta were not drafting a comprehensive peace settlement. At most, they were sketching general intentions and testing one another's reactions. Later critics who howled about broken promises overlooked the fundamental point. More specific understandings among the wartime allies, especially the two emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, awaited the arrival of peace. The United States and the Soviet Union. History provided little hope that the United States and the Soviet Union would reach cordial understandings about the shape of the post-war world. Mutual suspicions were ancient, abundant, and abiding. Communism and capitalism were historically hostile to social philosophies. The United States had refused officially to recognize the Bolshevik revolutionary government in Moscow until it was 16 years old in 1933. Soviet skepticism toward the West was nourished by the British and American delays in opening up a second front against Germany, while the Soviet army paid a grisly price to roll the Nazi invaders back across Russia and Eastern Europe. Britain and America had also frozen their Soviet ally out of their project to develop atomic weapons, further feeding Stalin's mistrust. The Washington government rubbed salt in Soviet wounds when it abruptly terminated vital Lend-Lease aid to the battered USSR in 1945 and spurred Moscow's plea for a $6 billion reconstruction loan while approving a similar loan of $3.7 billion to Britain in 1946. Different visions of the post-war world also separated the two superpowers. Stalin aimed above all to guarantee the security of the Soviet Union. The USSR had twice in the 20th century been stabbed in its heartland by attacks across the windswept plains of Eastern Europe. Stalin made it clear from the outset of the war that he was determined to have friendly governments along the Soviet western border, especially in Poland. By maintaining an extensive Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe, the USSR could protect itself and consolidate its revolutionary base as the world's leading communist country. To many Americans, that sphere of influence looked like an ill-gained empire. Doubting the Soviet goals were purely defensive, they remembered the earlier Bolshevik call for world revolution. Stalin's emphasis on spheres also clashed with Franklin Roosevelt's Wilsonian dream of an open world, decolonized, demilitarized, and democratized, with a strong international organization to oversee global peace. Even the ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union resembled each other were troublesome. Both countries had been largely isolated from world affairs before World War II, the United States through choice, the Soviet Union through rejection by other powers. Both nations also had a history of conducting a kind of missionary diplomacy, trying to export all the world the political doctrines precipitated out of their respective revolutionary origins. Unaccustomed to their great power roles, unfamiliar with or even antagonistic to each other, and each believing in the universal applicability of its own particular ideology, America and the USSR suddenly found themselves staring eyeball to eyeball over the prostrate body of a battered Europe. In these circumstances, some sort of confrontation was virtually unavoidable. The wartime Grand Alliance of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain had been a misbegotten child of necessity. When the hated Hitler fell, suspicion and rivalry between the communistic, despotic Russia and capitalistic democratic America were all but inevitable. In a fateful progression of events, marked often by the misperceptions as well as by genuine conflicts of interest, the two powers provoked each other into a sense of standoff known as the Cold War. Enduring 4.5 decades, the Cold War would not only shaped Soviet American relations, it overshadowed the entire post-war international order in every corner of the globe. Shaping the post-war world. Despite these obstacles, the United States did manage at wartime to erect some of the structures that would support Roosevelt's vision of an open world. The Atlantic Charter that he and Churchill had promulgated in 1941 proclaimed that for all nations the rights to self-determination and free access to trade, while committing to a post-war international system designed to ensure the human rights to freedom from fear and want for all individuals everywhere. As victory approached, the Western Allies worked to build the institutions that would embody those lofty goals. At the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, the Western Allies established the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to encourage world trade by regulating currency exchange rates. They also founded the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, World Bank, to promote economic growth in war-ravaged and underdeveloped areas. 3 years later, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, reduced trade barriers among member nations and helped to form the basis for a transformative spread of economic globalization in the latter half of the century. In contrast to its behavior after World War I, the United States took the lead in creating these important international bodies and supplied most of their funding. Victorious and robust at the end of a conflict that had laid waste to all the traditional great powers, America was uniquely positioned to shape the world order after World War II. The emerging Cold War conflict, meanwhile, ensured that the Soviets, those within their sphere of influence, would largely decline to participate in many of the new multilateral institutions. The emerging global order extended international governance to realms beyond economics. As flags wept on half-mast, the United Nations Conference opened on schedule, April 25, 1945, despite Roosevelt's dismaying death 13 days earlier. Unlike Woodrow Wilson with his League of Nations, Roosevelt had shrewdly moved to establish a new international body before the war's conclusion, so as to capitalize on the wartime spirit of cooperation and insulate planning for the United Nations from the potentially divisive issue of the peace settlement. Meeting at the San Francisco War Memorial Opera House, representatives from 50 nations fashioned the United Nations Charter. The United States took a leading role in shaping and funding the new organization, but in contrast to its absentation from other post-war economic institutions, the Soviet Union expected to be a key participant in this body. The UN was a successor to the old League of Nations, but it differed from its predecessor in significant ways. Born in a moment of idealism and designed to prevent another great power war, the League had adopted rules denying the veto power to any party to a dispute. The UN, by contrast, more realistically provided that no member of the Security Council, dominated by the Big Five powers, the US, Britain, the USSR, France, and China, could have action taken against it without its consent. The League, in short, presumed great power conflict. The UN presumed great power cooperation. Both approaches had their liabilities. The UN also featured the General Assembly, which could be controlled by smaller countries. In contrast to the chilly American reception of the League in 1919, the Senate overwhelmingly approved the UN Charter on July 28, 1945, by a vote of 89 to 2, not least because it provided safeguards for American sovereignty and freedom of action. The UN, setting up its permanent glass home in New York City, had some gratifying initial successes. It helped preserve peace in Iran, Kashmir, and other trouble spots. It played a large role in creating the new Jewish state of Israel. The UN Trusteeship Council guided former colonies to independence through such arms as UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, FAO, I don't know why I just said FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and WHO, World Health Organization. The UN brought benefits to peoples the world over. The fearsome new technology of the atom, however, put to an early test the spirit of cooperation on which the UN had been founded. The new organization failed this test badly. U.S. Delegate Bernard Baruch called in 1946 for a UN agency free from the great power veto with worldwide authority over atomic energy, weapons, and research. The Soviet delegate countered that the possession of nuclear weapons should simply be outlawed by every nation. President Truman said that it would be folly to throw away our gun until we are sure the rest of the world can't arm against us. The suspicious Soviets felt the same way and used their veto power to scuttle the proposals. A priceless opportunity to tame the nuclear monster in its infancy was lost. The problem of Germany. Hitler's ruined Reich posed especially thorny problems for all of the wartime allies. They agreed only that the cancer of Nazism had to be cut out of the German body politic, which involved punishing Nazi leaders for war crimes. The Allies joined in trying 22 top culprits at the Nuremberg war crimes trial during 1945-46. Accusations included committing war crimes against the laws of war and humanity and plotting aggressions contrary to solemn treaty pledges. Justice, Nuremberg style, was harsh. 12 of the accused Nazis swung from the gallows, and 7 were sentenced to long jail terms. Foxy Hermann Göring, whose blubbery chest had once blazed with ribbons, cheated the hangman a few hours before his scheduled execution by swallowing a hidden cyanide capsule. The trials of several small-fry Nazis continued for years. Some legal critics in America and elsewhere condemned these proceedings as judicial lynchings because the victims were tried for offenses that had not been clear-cut crimes when the war began. Beyond punishing the top Nazis, the Allies could agree on little about post-war Germany. Some American Hitler haters, nothing that industrialized Germany had been a brutal aggressor, at first wanted to dismantle German factories and reduce the country to a potato patch. The Soviets, denied American economic assistance, were determined to rebuild their shattered land by extracting enormous reparations from the Germans. Both these desires clashed headlong with the reality that an industrial, healthy German economy was indispensable to the recovery of Europe. Along with Austria, Germany had been divided at war's end into 4 military occupation zones, each assigned to one of the big 4 powers, France, Britain, America, and the USSR. The Western Allies refused to allow Moscow to bleed their zones with the reparations that Stalin insisted he had been promised at Yalta. They also began to promote the idea of a reunited Germany. The Communists responded by tightening their grip on their eastern zone. Before long, it was apparent that Germany would remain indefinitely divided. West Germany eventually became an independent country, wedded to the West. East Germany, along with the other Soviet-dominated Eastern European countries such as Poland and Hungary, became nominally independent satellite states bound to the Soviet Union. Eastern Europe virtually disappeared from the western sight behind the iron curtain of secrecy and isolation that Stalin clanged down across Europe from the Baltic to the Adriatic. This division of Europe would endure for more than 4 decades. With Germany now split in two, there remained the problem of the rubble heap known as Berlin. Lying deep within the Soviet zone, this beleaguered isle in the Red Sea had been broken, like Germany as a whole, into sectors occupied by troops of each of the four victorious powers. In 1948, following the controversies over German currency reform and four-power control, the Soviets abruptly choked off all rail and highway access to Berlin. They eventually reasoned that the Allies would be starved out. Berlin became a hugely symbolic issue for both sides. At stake was not only the fate of the city, but a test of wills between Moscow and Washington. The Americans organized the gigantic Berlin airlift in the midst of a hair-trigger tension. For nearly a year, flying some of the very aircraft that had recently dropped bombs on Berlin, American pilots ferried thousands of tons of supplies a day to the grateful Berliners, their former enemies. Western Europeans took heart from this vivid demonstration of America's determination to honor its commitments in Europe. The Soviets, their bluff dramatically called, finally lifted their blockade in May 1949. In the same year, the governments of the two Germanys, East and West, were formally established. The Cold War had icily congealed. Ooh, sorry. My mouth is like, oh. Cold War deepens. A crafty Stalin also probed the West's resolve at other sensitive points, including oil-rich Iran. Seeking to secure oil concessions similar to those held by British and Americans, Stalin in 1946 broke an agreement to remove his troops from Iran's northernmost province, which the USSR had occupied during World War II. Instead, he used the troops to aid a rebel movement. Truman sent off a stinging protest, and the Soviet dictator backed down. Moscow's hardline policies in Germany, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East wrought a psychological Pearl Harbor. The eyes of Americans were jarred wide open by the Kremlin's apparent unwillingness to continue the wartime partnership. Any remaining goodwill from a period of comradeship in arms evaporated in a cloud of dark distrust. "I'm tired of babying the Soviets," Truman remarked privately in 1946 as attitudes on both sides began to harden frostily. Truman's piecemeal responses to various Soviet challenges took on an intellectual coherence in 1947 with the formulation of a containment doctrine. Crafted by brilliant young... Crafted by a brilliant young diplomat and Soviet specialist George F. Kennan, this concept held that Russia, whether Tsarist or communist, was relentlessly expansionary, but the Kremlin was also cautious, Kennan argued, and the flow of Soviet power into every nook and cranny available to it could be stemmed by firm and vigilant containment. Truman embraced Kennan's advice when he formally and publicly adopted a get tough with Russia policy in 1947. His first dramatic move was triggered by a word that heavily burdened Britain could no longer bear the financial and military load of defending Greece against communist pressures. If Greece fell, Turkey would presumably collapse, and the strategic eastern Mediterranean would pass into the Soviet orbit. In a surprise appearance, the president went before Congress on March 12, 1947, and requested support for what became known as the Truman Doctrine. Specifically, he asked for $400 million to bolster Greece and Turkey, which Congress quickly granted. More generally, he declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, a sweeping and open-ended commitment of vast and worrisome proportions. Critics then and later charged that Truman had overreacted by promising unlimited support to any tin-horn despot who claimed to be resisting communist aggression. Critics also complained that the Truman Doctrine needlessly polarized the world into pro-Soviet and pro-American camps and unwisely construed the Soviet threat as primarily military in nature. Apologists for Truman have explained that it was Truman's fear of revived isolationism that led him to exaggerate the Soviet threat and to pitch his message in the charged language of a holy global war against godless communism. Meanwhile, a threat of a different sort loomed in Western Europe, especially France, Italy, and Germany. These key nations were still suffering from the hunger and the economic chaos spawned by war. They were in grave danger of being taken over from the inside by communist parties that could exploit these hardships. President Truman responded with a bold policy in keeping with America's post-war desire for a liberalized global economy. In a commencement address at Harvard University on June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall invited the Europeans to get together and work out a joint plan for their economic recovery. If they did so, then the United States would provide substantial financial assistance. This forced cooperation constituted a powerful nudge on the road to the eventual creation of the European Community, EC. The democratic nations of Europe rose enthusiastically to the life-giving bait of the so-called Marshall Plan. They met in Paris in July 1947 to thrash out the details. There, Marshall offered the same aid to the Soviet Union and its allies if they would make political reforms and accept certain outside controls. In fact, the Americans worried that the Russian bear might hug the Marshall Plan to death and therefore made the terms deliberately difficult for the USSR to accept. Nobody was surprised when the Soviets walked out, denouncing the Marshall Plan as one more capitalist trick. The Marshall Plan called for spending $12.5 billion over 4 years in 16 cooperating countries. Congress at first balked on this mammoth sum. It took even huger when it added to the nearly $2 billion the United States had already contributed to Europe through the UN Relief and the Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, and the hefty American contributions to the UN, IMF, and World Bank. But a Soviet-sponsored communist group in Czechoslovakia finally awakened the legislators to reality, and they voted the initial appropriations in April 1948. Congress evidently concluded that if Uncle Sam did not get the Europeans back on their feet, they would never get off his back. Truman's Marshall Plan was a spectacular success. American dollars pumped reviving blood into the economic veins of the anemic Western European nations. Within a few years, most of them were exceeding their pre-war outputs as an economic miracle drenched Europe in prosperity. The communist parties in Italy and France lost ground, and these two keystone countries were saved from the westward thrust of communism. A resolute Truman made another fateful decision in 1948. Access to Middle Eastern oil was crucial to the European recovery program and increasingly to the health of the U.S. economy given finite American oil reserves. Yet the Arab oil countries adamantly opposed the creation of the Jewish state of Israel and the British Mandate territory of Palestine. Should Israel be born, a Saudi Arabian leader warned Truman, the Arabs will lay siege to it until it dies of famine. Defying Arab wrath as well as the objections of his own state and defense departments and the European allies, Truman officially recognized the state of Israel on the day of its birth, May 14, 1948. Humanitarian sympathy for the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust ranked high among his reasons, and he did his wishes to preempt Soviet influence in the Jewish state and to retain the support of American Jewish voters. Truman's policy of strong support for Israel would vastly complicate U.S. relations with the Arab world in the decades ahead. America begins to rearm. The Cold War, the struggle to contain Soviet communism, was not war yet. It was not peace. The standoff with the Kremlin banished the dreams of the tax-fatigued Americans so the tanks could be... The standoff with the Kremlin banished the dreams of the tax-fatigued Americans that tanks could be beaten into automobiles. The Soviet menace spurred the unification of the armed services as well as the creation of a huge new national security apparatus. Congress in 1947 passed the National Security Act, creating the Department of Defense. The department was to be housed in the sprawling Pentagon building on the banks of the Potomac and to be headed by a new cabinet officer, the Secretary of Defense. Under the Secretary, but without cabinet status, were the civilian secretaries of the Navy, the Army, replacing the old Secretary of War, and the Air Force, a recognition of the rising importance of air power. The uniformed heads of each service were brought together as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The National Security Act also established a National Security Council and a SEAD to advise the President on security matters and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to coordinate the government's foreign fact-gathering. The Voice of America, authorized by Congress in 1948, began beaming American radio broadcasts behind the Iron Curtain. In the same year, Congress resurrected the military draft, providing for the conscription of selected young men from 19 to 25 years of age. The forbidding presence of the selective service system shaped millions of young people's educational, marital, and career plans in the following quarter century. One issue at a time, a war-weary American was reluctant in returning to a war footing. The Soviet threat was forcing the democracies of Western Europe into an unforeseen degree of unity. In 1948, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg signed a path-breaking treaty of defensive alliance at Brussels. They then invited the U.S. to join them. The proposal confronted the U.S. with a historic decision. America had traditionally avoided entangling alliances, especially in peacetime, if the Cold War could be considered peacetime. Yet American participation in the emerging coalition would serve many purposes. It would strengthen the policy of containing the Soviet Union, it would provide a framework for the reintegration of Germany into the European family, and it would reassure Judeo Europeans that a traditionally isolationist Uncle Sam was not about to abandon them to the marauding Russian bear, or to a resurgent and domineering Germany. The Truman administration decided to join the European Pact, called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and thereby granted a transatlantic charter. With white tie pageantry, the NATO treaty was signed in Washington on April 4, 1949. The 12 original signatories pledged to regard an attack on one as an attack on all and promised to respond with armed force if necessary. Despite last-ditch from removable isolationists, the Senate approved the treaty on July 21, 1949 by a vote of 82 to 13. Membership was boosted to 14 in 1952 with the inclusion of Greece and Turkey, to 15 in 1955 with the addition of West Germany. The NATO Pact was epical. It marked a dramatic departure from American diplomatic convention, a gigantic boost for European unification, and a significant step in the militarization of the Cold War. NATO became the cornerstone of all Cold War American policy toward Europe, with good reason pundits summed up NATO's threefold purpose: to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. Rogue. I'm just checking how much is left. A lot is left. I haven't read that much. This is hellish. Okay. Reconstruction and revolution in Asia. Reconstruction in Japan was simpler than in Germany, primarily because it was largely a one-man and one-army show. The occupying American army, under the The Supreme Allied Commander, 5-star General Douglas MacArthur, sat in the driver's seat in the teeth of violent protests from Soviet officials. MacArthur went inflexibly ahead with his program for the democratization of Japan. Following the pattern in Germany, top Japanese war criminals were tried in Tokyo from 1946 to 1948. 18 of them were sentenced to prison terms and 7 were hanged. General MacArthur is a kind of Yankee Mikado, I guess. Yes, because it's Japan. As a kind of Yankee Mikado, enjoyed stunning success. The Japanese cooperated to an astonishing degree. They saw that good behavior and the adoption of democracy would speed the end of the occupation as it did. A MacArthur-dictated constitution was adopted in 1946. It renounced militarism, provided for women's equality, and introduced Western styles of democratic government, paving the way for a phenomenal economic recovery that within a few decades made Japan one of the world's mightiest industrial powers. Ironically, as with the U.S.-supported recovery of Western European economies, Japan's post-war ascendance eventually helped to end America's honeymoon as the unchallenged global economic kingpin. Despite such ironies, Japan provided an uncontestable post-war success story for American policymakers. The opposite was true in China, where a bitter civil war had raged for years between nationalists and communists. Washington half-heartedly supported the nationalist government of Generalissimo in his struggle with the communists under Mao Zedong. But ineptitude and corruption within the Generalissimo's regime gradually corroded the confidence of his people. Communist armies swept south, and late in 1949, Jiang was forced to flee with the remnants of his once powerful force to the last hope of Formosa, Taiwan. The collapse of the nationalist China was a depressing defeat for America and its allies in the Cold War, the worst to date. At one fell swoop, nearly 1/4 of the world's population, some 500 million people, was swept into the communist camp. The so-called fall of China became a bitterly partisan issue in the United States. The Republicans seeking out those who had lost China assailed President Truman and his bristly mustached Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. They insisted that democratic agencies warming with communists had deliberately withheld aid from Jiang Jiechi to trip into his fall. More bad news came in September 1949 when President Truman shocked the nation by announcing that the Soviets had exploded an atomic bomb, approximately 3 years earlier than many experts had thought possible. American strategists since 1945 had counted on keeping the Soviets in line by threats of a one-sided aerial attack with nuclear weapons, but atomic bombing was now a game that True could play. To outplace the Soviets in nuclear weaponry, Truman ordered the development of the H-bomb, hydrogen bomb, a city-smashing thermonuclear weapon that was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. J. Robert Oppenheimer, former scientific director of the Manhattan Project and current chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, led a group of scientists in opposition to the program to design thermonuclear weapons on the grounds that it approached genocide. Albert Einstein, the physicist whose theories had helped give birth to the atomic age, declared that annihilation of any life on Earth has been brought within the range of technical possibilities. But Einstein and Oppenheimer, the nation's two most famous scientists, could not dissuade Truman, anxious over communist threats in East Asia, from proceeding with the H-bomb. The United States exploded its first hydrogen device on a South Pacific atoll in 1952. Not to be outdone, the Soviets countered with their first H-bomb explosion in 1953. The nuclear arms race had entered a perilously competitive cycle, spurred on by massive state support for defense-related scientific research in both countries. It was only constrained by the recognition that a truly hot Cold War would leave no world for the communists to communize, the democracy to democratize. Peace through mutual terror brought a shaky stability to the superpower standoff. Excuse me. I think I'll only read a little more, because I'm about halfway through. The Korean volcano erupts. Korea, the land of the morning calm, heralded a new and more disturbing phase of the Cold War, a shooting phase, in June 1950. When Japan collapsed in 1945, Soviet troops had accepted the Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel on the Korean peninsula, and American troops had done likewise south of that line. Both superpowers professed to want the reunification and independence of Korea, a Japanese colony since 1910. But, as in Germany, each helped to set up rival regimes above and below the parallel. By 1949, when the Soviets and Americans had both withdrawn their forces, the entire peninsula was a bristling armed camp with two hostile regimes eyeing each other suspiciously. The explosion came on June 25, 1950. Spearheaded by Soviet-made tanks, North Korean army columns rumbled across the 38th parallel. Caught flat-footed, the South Korean forces were shoved back southward into a dangerously tiny defensive area around Busan, their weary backs to the sea. President Truman sprang quickly into the breach. The invasion seemed to provide devastating proof of a fundamental premise in the containment doctrine that shaped Washington's foreign policy. Even a slight relaxation of America's guard was an invitation to communist aggression somewhere. The Korean invasion prompted a massive expansion of American military. A few months before, Truman's National Security Council had issued its famous National Security Council memorandum, Number 68, NSC 68, recommending that the United States quadruple its defense spending. Ignored at first because it seemed politically impossible to implement, NSC 68 got a new lease on life in the Korean crisis. Korea saved us, Secretary of State Atkinson later commented. Truman ordered the massive military buildup well beyond what was necessary for Korea. Soon, the United States had 3.5 million men under arms and was spending $50 billion per year on the defense budget, some 13% of the GNP. NSC 68 was a key document of the Cold War period, not only because it marked a major step in the militarization of American foreign policy, but also because it vividly reflected the sense of almost limitless possibility that pervaded post-war American society. NSC 68 rested on the assumption that the enormous American economy could bear without strain the huge cost of a gigantic rearmament program. Said one NSC 68 planner, there was practically nothing the country could not do if it wanted to do it. Truman took full advantage of a temporary Soviet absence from the United States Security Council on June 25, 1950, to obtain a unanimous condemnation of North Korea as an aggressor. Why the Soviets were absent remains controversial. Scholars once believed that the Soviets were just as surprised as the Americans by the attack. It now appears that Stalin had given his reluctant approval to North Korea's strike plan, but believed that the fighting would be brief and that the United States would take little interest in it. The Security Council also called upon all UN members, including the United States, to render every assistance to restore peace. 2 days later, without consulting Congress, Truman ordered American air and naval units to support South Korea. Before the week was out, he also ordered General Douglas MacArthur's Japan-based occupation troops into action alongside the beleaguered South Koreans. So began the ill-fated Korean War. Officially, the United States was simply participating in a United Nations police action. Participating nations, including Great Britain, Canada, and the Philippines, did make significant troop contributions, but the United States provided 88% of the UN contingents, and General MacArthur, UN commander of the entire operation, took his orders from Washington, not from the Security Council. Okay, there's a lot of stuff left, but it's been 30 minutes, and, I've decided that I need to take break now. Okay.